Russell Wilson is the only quarterback in NFL history to start his career with 9 consecutive winning seasons, yet his legacy is currently defined by the $85 million dead cap hit the Denver Broncos absorbed just to get him off their roster. The trajectory of Wilson's career presents one of the most polarizing Hall of Fame debates in modern sports history. Early on, he was the model of efficiency in clutch performance, the face of a Seattle Seahawks franchise that dominated the NFC. Later, he became a cautionary tale of franchise-altering trades and rapid athletic decline, bouncing between teams in a desperate bid to reclaim his former glory. It raises a fascinating question about how we evaluate greatness when the final chapters of a career actively rewrite the narrative of the early ones.
The contrast between the Seattle years and the post-Seattle years is stark, and it fundamentally complicates his Hall of Fame resume. When you look at his first decade in the league, the resume seems undeniable. 9 Pro Bowls, a Super Bowl championship, 2 NFC titles, and over 100 regular season wins in his first 10 years. He was the master of the deep ball and off-schedule plays. But the Hall of Fame evaluates the totality of a career. The criteria aren't just about peak performance. They demand sustained excellence and a lasting positive impact on the game. The disaster in Denver, followed by his transition into a journeyman quarterback, significantly damages that sustained excellence argument. According to the Pro Football Hall of Fame Monitor, which tracks standard metrics for enshrinement, Wilson sits precariously on the bubble, and the negative recency bias surrounding his late career struggles might be too heavy an anchor.
Focusing on that early Seattle era is crucial because it sets up the entire let Russ cook phenomenon that eventually unraveled. In those first few years under Pete Carroll, the Seahawks relied heavily on the Legion of Boom defense and Marshawn Lynch's ground game. Wilson was cast as the ultimate game manager who could execute devastating play-action passes and bail the team out on third down with his legs. But there was always this underlying tension. A significant portion of the football analytics community argued that Seattle was suppressing a generational talent by running a conservative offense. When he finally got the keys to the offense, the raw numbers spiked, but the team's success didn't follow in the same way. Does the context of Seattle's defense artificially inflate his early legacy, or was he the indispensable engine of those Super Bowl runs?
It is a mixture of both, which is why his evaluation is so difficult. During the 2013 Super Bowl run, the defense historically stifled Peyton Manning's record-breaking offense. Wilson threw for just over 200 yards in that Super Bowl victory. He was highly efficient, but he was not the focal point. However, as the Legion of Boom aged and dispersed, Wilson's burden increased dramatically. By 2017, he accounted for over 80% of Seattle's total offensive yards and led the league in passing touchdowns. That period demonstrated he was capable of carrying an offense. The problem emerged when his physical traits began to wane. Wilson's unique style relied heavily on escaping the pocket, extending plays for 4 or 5 seconds, and throwing his signature high-arcing deep ball. As he lost that elite burst of speed in his early 30s, NFL defenses adapted. They started playing split safety coverages, forcing him to stay in the pocket and throw over the middle of the field, a specific area where his height limitation became a severe liability.
That structural flaw in his game became painfully obvious after the trade to the Denver Broncos. The Broncos gave up multiple first-round picks, second-round picks, and key players, then signed him to a 5-year, $242 million extension before he ever took a snap. The result was arguably the worst trade in NFL history. In his first season in Denver, the offense was historically inept, finishing dead last in scoring. He took a staggering 55 sacks. The lack of pocket presence and the inability to process defensive adjustments over the middle of the field were exposed on a weekly basis. This wasn't just a minor decline, it was a catastrophic collapse of a franchise's foundation. When evaluating a Hall of Fame candidate, how much weight should voters put on a failure of that magnitude, especially when it directly cost a franchise its competitive window?
Voters will weigh it heavily because it shattered the illusion of his individual invincibility. Prior to Denver, the narrative was that Pete Carroll was holding Wilson back. The Denver experiment proved the opposite. It suggested that Carroll's system was actively protecting Wilson from his own limitations. When Sean Payton arrived in Denver to salvage the situation in 2023, he essentially had to rein Wilson in, heavily scripting the offense to manage him rather than unleash him. Even though Wilson's statistical ratios improved under Payton, the underlying metrics regarding success rate and third down efficiency remained poor. The fact that the Broncos chose to incur an $85 million dead cap charge, shattering the previous NFL record, just to release him speaks volumes. It indicates that a highly respected offensive mind concluded that having Wilson on the roster was more detrimental than playing with a massive financial handicap. That is a devastating blow to a legacy.
Following that release, his transition to a journeyman quarterback with teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers further diluted his prestige. Instead of fading gracefully or adapting his game like a Drew Brees or Tom Brady, Wilson bounced around, competing for starting jobs and frequently looking like a backup. This late-career wandering contrasts sharply with surefire Hall of Famers who either maintain a high level of play until the end or retire before the decline becomes embarrassing. It brings up the concept of the fame aspect of the Hall of Fame. Wilson was undoubtedly one of the most famous and discussed players of his era, but fame is not synonymous with enduring greatness. His career arc resembles a spectacular fireworks display that ended with a long, sputtering fizzle. Does the sheer volume of his early accolades, the wins, the passer rating, the iconic moments like the Malcolm Butler interception in Super Bowl XLIX, provide enough of a buffer against this late career damage?
The Super Bowl XLIX interception is a fascinating touchstone. While it is remembered as a catastrophic failure, it also highlights that he was at the absolute pinnacle of the sport, 1 yard away from back-to-back championships. But to answer your question about the buffer, the precedent for modern quarterbacks suggests it is not enough. The threshold for quarterbacks is incredibly high. Players like Eli Manning face intense scrutiny despite winning 2 Super Bowl MVPs, largely because of his inconsistent regular season performance and career .500 record. Wilson's regular season record is vastly superior, but he lacks an MVP award or even a single first-team All-Pro selection. He was never widely considered the absolute best quarterback in football in any given year. He was always existing in the tier just below Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, and Patrick Mahomes. When you combine the lack of peak individual dominance with the catastrophic end to his career, the argument for Canton becomes structurally unsound. He ends up looking more like a compiler of statistics in a pass-happy era than a transcendent, foundational player of his generation.
The lack of a single MVP vote for the majority of his career is a glaring omission on a Hall of Fame resume. It reinforces the idea that he was a beneficiary of his circumstances as much as he was a driver of them. Beyond the field, there is the impending transition into broadcasting and media. Wilson has always been hyper-conscious of his public image, often criticized for being overly polished, robotic, or inauthentic, the danger Russ persona, the constant motivational catchphrases. As he moves into the booth or the studio, that perfectly curated image might face a harsh reality check. Successful broadcasters like Tony Romo or Peyton Manning thrive on authenticity, self-deprecation, and an ability to analyze the game dynamically. Wilson's historical tendency to rely on platitudes could make that transition significantly more difficult than his transition from college to the pros.
Broadcasting requires a level of vulnerability and off-the-cuff insight that Wilson has rarely displayed publicly. His media interactions throughout his playing career were famously guarded. Every press conference felt meticulously scripted to project relentless optimism, even amid the Denver disasters. That approach alienated some teammates, as reports frequently surfaced about a disconnect between Wilson and the locker room, both in Seattle and Denver. In a broadcasting environment, audiences crave genuine perspective, especially from former players. If he attempts to bring that same corporate, overly manicured persona to an analyst role, it will likely fall flat. However, if he is willing to deconstruct his own career, including the failures, and offer genuine insight into the immense pressure of the NFL, he has the football IQ to succeed. The question is whether he is willing to drop the armor.
It requires a complete reinvention of his public persona, which might be the most challenging pivot of his professional life. Looking at the entirety of Russell Wilson's journey, the narrative is undeniably tragic in a sporting sense. He defied the odds as an undersized third-round draft pick to reach the summit of the sport, only to orchestrate his own exit from the environment that perfectly suited him. The desire to prove he was a traditional pocket passer, capable of carrying a franchise independently, ultimately exposed his fatal flaws. The bouncing around at the end of his career, clinging to a fading skill set, cements the reality that he belongs in the Hall of Very Good. He was a brilliant, unique talent who defined a decade of Seattle football, but the historical weight of his late career implosion and his failure to adapt his game pushes him just outside the gates of Canton.
That assessment captures the nuance of his legacy perfectly. The NFL is unforgiving to quarterbacks who lose their mobility and cannot process from the pocket. Wilson's final years serve as a brutal case study in how quickly a guaranteed Hall of Fame trajectory can be derailed by ego, poor fit, and physical decline. History will remember the beautiful moonballs and the incredible escapes, but the permanent record will also reflect the record-breaking dead cap hits, the locker room friction, and the inability to evolve. It is a complex legacy, one that will generate debate for decades, but the ultimate conclusion points toward exclusion from the sport's highest honor.
That marks a definitive line in the sand on a career that will be debated for years to come. Pass this episode along to anyone who loves deep dives into the complexities of sports legacies and the real conversations behind the stats on the Real Sports Talk podcast network.